Alright guys, welcome to our Chapter 12 lecture. This is going to be a more brief review of the most important concepts from the chapter because we did most of the details already in class. But here are some of the key concepts I want you to have understood either after the lecture in class or after this review. These are things you guys should know. Again, not too much vocabulary. Most of you guys know this word already. It's used in the textbook in relation to the Mongols, which I'm not really going to talk about too much here. This is an important term, though, from the chapter, trade diaspora, and I will review that briefly. So like you guys noticed, and like I already said, Chapter 12 is really about world trade routes before European influence in them. And as I said before, one of the reasons we care about these trade routes is because even though they don't involve Europeans too much, they do play a huge role in what Europeans are going to do later. Remember we talked about the Silk trade routes, how Europe is on the western edge of that. They're at the end of the line, so they're not really too involved in cultural diffusion like the rest of the players are, but they are receiving the goods from the east at a very high price because those merchants are going back and forth between trade posts 100 miles or so apart, and they're ferrying goods back and forth and raising the price of the goods each time they move them from point A to point B to the point where the prices get really, really high over here. And since Europe's at the end of the line, they can't really trade with anybody else. They're paying a high price, they're not getting much out of it. That's going to lead to their motivations to cut out the middlemen and engage in ocean-based exploration and trade later on. So that's part of the reason why this is important for what's going to happen next. Alright, also remember there's a difference in how long-distance trade works now and how it used to work. Nowadays, we get almost everything from more than 100 miles away. Back during this time period, the 600s to the 1400s, it was very different. Most of the goods that you use on a day-to-day basis came from right in your own backyard. Your food, your clothes, your tools, all your necessities came locally pretty much. The goods that made those long distance trips along the Silk routes and along the Indian Ocean trade routes were the luxury items. Examples are like gold, spices, silk, precious gems, etc., etc. What do these things have in common? We talked about in class how they have a high value to weight ratio, right? So gold's kind of heavy, but it's really, really valuable. Silk maybe not as valuable as gold, still pretty valuable though, and very light. That means that a merchant could transport a lot of these things and make a pretty high profit. He's not going to bother trading necessities a long distance because it's too expensive for him. It's too risky. But trading luxury goods to folks who are going to pay a high price for it means that you can make a profit and it's worth the trip. The goods that were traded aren't as important, again, as the cultural diffusion that happens when these goods are traded. So, theme 4 for economics, cultural diffusion, which is happening a lot here, would be theme 2, right? So some of the impacts that we see in addition to cultural diffusion are impacts on cities, right? Cities, as I said before, have already existed. They start to spring up as soon as agriculture does, but those older agricultural cities in Central Asia, especially along the Silk Roads, are getting a whole bunch of new roles now, and now that they are engaging in trade with their neighbors. They become rest stops, they become centers of learning, okay? They become cultural interaction zones. And sometimes there's actually new cities that are created during this place and time, especially as a result of Indian Ocean trade routes. You guys answered pretty easily in class that most of those cities are going to be around the coast, right? So examples of those coastal cities would be like Mogadishu, Kilwa, Zanzibar. There are others that aren't listed here, but Southeast African city-states were heavily involved in Indian Ocean trade, as were South Asian cities on the Indian coastline, as were Indonesian and Southeast Asian cities, as were coastal cities along the Arabian Peninsula. It's a combination of theme 4 for trade and theme 1, your interaction with your environment. Obviously, if you're engaging in ocean-based trade, it makes sense environmentally to have those trading posts along the coast. So we could talk about any of those trading cities in Central Asia, which are important to know about, or in Indonesia or Southeast Asia. But I want to talk about the Southeast African trading city-states because African history oftentimes gets neglected, and it's those neglected regions that oftentimes show up on the AP exam. So, what if the AP exam asked you to write a continuity and change over time type essay about trade or migration in Africa from, say, the 600s to the 1800s or something? This information could be very useful to us because a lot of us know that slaves were exported by Europeans across the Atlantic Ocean from West Africa, but very few of us may have realized that there was a slave trade facilitated by outsiders before then. Arabs involved in a slave trade in those Indian Ocean trade routes leaving from Southeast African city-states. Another continuity change combo would be the fact that the continuity is that the same sorts of materials, that is raw materials, are being exported from the African mainland. In this case, ivory, animal skins, tortoise shells from this time period. Later on, raw materials continue to be exported by Europeans, more so precious metals, mineral wealth, but they're still raw materials, different raw materials, but still raw materials. Also a continuity, like I said before, is that slaves were exported, but in a different place by different people. So you can see kind of how there's continuities and changes going on with African trade during this time period, and the one we'll talk about next time. What themes are we talking about here, especially if we're talking about slave trade? Well, trade is a common theme for this chapter. That's theme 4. If you're being forced to migrate, even if it's against your will, migration is still theme 1 though. So as negative as the Arab slave trade was for Africans in Southeast Africa, at least those Africans who got enslaved, there were some positive impacts with Arabian involvement in Southeast Africa as well, namely cultural diffusion and cultural enrichment that came as a result. An example would be the Swahili language. Swahili is actually a combination of a native East African language brought to Southeast Africa by the Bantu people. I'll write that here. It'd be good if you guys knew that the Bantu people were the ones responsible for bringing the native language to Southeast Africa, and that combined with Arabic in order to form this new language. What themes are we talking about? It's 4 and 2 again, trade and cultural diffusion. Well, Southeast Africa wasn't the only place where trade was leading to states being built and gaining strength. Northwest Africa had a little bit of that going on as well. The difference is that it was land-based rather than ocean-based trade that led to the development of strong states there. And like I said in class, we're going to kind of lump these 3 together in our heads. Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, in that order, are 3 empires that, while they have some differences culturally, I think have more in common because of how they were built. And they were built, as we said, because of their location along important trade routes, trans-Saharan trade routes. how do those trade routes develop? Well, remember we talked about the camels playing a huge role in that. And you'll notice here the dates, right? 11th century, 14th century, 15th century. What all these have in common? It's all after Islam and Islamic empires spread across North Africa. Camels diffused from the Arabian Peninsula over here off the map to North Africa. And camels were really the only animals hardy enough to be able to cross the really harsh Sahara Desert. So you really wouldn't have had a robust trans-Saharan trade without camels, and you wouldn't really have camels here without the empire of Islam bringing those camels across North Africa. So we have to wait until after Islam spreads there in the 8th century for these empires to develop a few centuries later. What themes are we talking about here? Well, 3 is empire building, and if it's as a result of trade, that's 4. And remember, that trade really can't happen without an environmental factor, that domestic animal, the camel, being diffused over through migration of peoples of an empire before any of this other stuff can occur. Here's a closer view reminding us of why Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were successful trading empires. Remember, the blue highlighted area is an area of intensive salt production. The gold color is an area of intensive gold production. All of the cities in between were either capitals or major trading posts that were part of one or more of those 3 trading empires. And while you can see that there's really not a whole lot of gold or salt around any of these cities, what they did have was that perfect location as middlemen. So remember that as merchants had to bring their salt and their gold through this territory, the folks in the middle would tax them, tax and regulate the trade. So the merchants paid the tax because they knew these imperial cities had armies that could help protect the trade. And of course the folks in the middle, in addition to benefiting as cultural centers, centers of learning, benefited economically, and so their empires grew. It's an example of John Green's merchants deciding where the leaders or the people where the funny hats go, not the other way around. Also remember that besides gold and salt, these other items down here, slaves, ivory, horses, glassware, also moved across this trans-Saharan trade. And also remember that the gold for salt deal seems kind of silly at first until you remember these guys had a lot of gold, these guys had a lot of salt, and salt is something that's necessary biologically for our survival. So while it might seem silly to trade gold for salt, they did it because gold was not so precious to these folks, and salt certainly was when you're down here sweating a lot very close to the equator. Alright, on to trade diasporas, probably our most important vocabulary term from this chapter. The term has really 2 parts to it. There's the trade part and the diaspora. Let's start with the trade part. Alright, trade in this sense means your job. Right? So I'll write that for you. You want to remember that trade basically means your job in this sense. Diaspora, we already learned what that meant. That's a group of individuals who are spread apart geographically, but something unifies them. In a trade diaspora, that something that unifies you is your job. Okay? Something else to remember about trade diasporas is that sometimes they can overlap with religious or other kinds of cultural diasporas. For example, there were merchant communities of Jewish people spread all across the Silk trade routes as well as the Indian Ocean trade routes. And those folks often supported each other in their business. So they might have the same job, merchant, they might also have the same religion, Judaism. Same sort of thing happened with Islam. Arab merchants who happened to be Islamic would oftentimes convert the folks they traded with in Indonesia, for example, so that they had a religious as well as a business connection. What's going on as far as world history themes? Well, the religious is theme 2, it's part of culture, and back to theme 4 for economic. The Empire of Aksum, remember, was one of those specific cases where religion affected business, and in fact that in turn affected politics, or the political strength of an empire. Remember, Aksum was a Christian empire. It had Christian trading partners in Egypt, in the Middle East, and as Islam expanded and took over that territory, it lost a lot of that Christian connection to the folks it had been trading with. Because of those religious differences, their business sort of fell, their economic side of their empire diminished, and that in turn made it more difficult for them to be a political power or fund a military. So eventually they wind up getting conquered because of that. That's religion, impacting trade, impacting politics. Theme 2, 4, and 3. This slide's about a region that doesn't get a whole lot of attention in world history, but we're going to talk about Polynesia here because it's noteworthy for 3 different reasons. First of all, Polynesia is usually defined as the Pacific Islands in this triangle between New Zealand, Easter Island, and the Hawaiian Islands. What's so special about it? Well, first of all, the way it's settled. Most of the world, practically all the world, was originally settled on foot, folks migrating via land bridges to get to their territory. With Polynesian islands, that can't really be the case because there's thousands of miles of ocean between each one of these. You had to get there by boat. And these folks are pretty adventurous to take relatively small craft like this out there. The other interesting thing about the Polynesian islands is you'd expect that because it took hundreds of years to settle them and there's such a wide gap in terms of geographic distance between them, that there'd be some sort of cultural distance decay over time, right, where the culture of these people started to diverge pretty greatly. But that really didn't happen, actually. There's a Polynesian language group that these native folks speak, and pretty much you can understand the conversations of a speaker of a far-off island, even if you come from one thousands of miles away, which is pretty interesting. The third reason that we talk about Polynesian islands is that the folks who settled here may have had contact with the Americas. How do historians try to prove that theory? Well, there's some American food items, root crops in the potato family, that have made their way somehow to some of the eastern Polynesian islands. Some historians say there's really no way that those crops could have gotten there without human intervention, probably that of the Polynesians. Again, that's not proven, but it is a theory. What themes are we talking about here? Mostly one, because we're talking about migration, right? And it's important to remember that in many cases there were push factors that led to these folks migrating. It seems pretty crazy for these folks to take these ships out thousands of miles into the ocean open, not knowing whether you're going to starve or not. But remember, if they had stayed on their islands, as these islands became increasingly populated, they might have very well starved on the island. So it was a risk that these folks were very often willing to take. It's also important to remember that they got some of their sailing technology that allowed them to settle those islands from the Malay people of Southeast Asia. And these folks, remember, had pretty good amount of sailing knowledge themselves because they had been working with those monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean for quite some time, developing things like the lateen sail, which is important if you are sailing in a direction where you don't have the wind directly at your back. We end in the Eastern Hemisphere with China. And remember, China during this time can't really figure out whether it wants to be isolated economically and culturally from other groups, or whether it wants to be involved economically and culturally trading with other groups. Well, the Mongols pretty much make this decision for them, because what the Mongols do as they're taking over land in China's northern half is they're capturing trade routes that the Chinese had access for Silk Road trade. They're capturing resources. And if the Chinese say that they're going to fight the Mongols militarily, they have to maintain their economic base. So as they're pushed further and further south, they're pushed to the coast. And they begin to engage in international sea trade in the Indian Ocean. And interestingly enough, even after the Mongols were kicked out by the Chinese, a few hundred years later, they continued this international sea trade, at least for a time. And the famous Chinese explorer Zheng He really exemplifies China as it's coming out of its economic and cultural shell. Remember, he made 7 different voyages all across the Indian Ocean, landing in India 3 times, the Arabian Peninsula at least once, and those Southeast African city-states another 3 times. What were his goals? Remember, they were mostly political, more so than just economic. He had hundreds of treasure ships sailing with him, and he was actually giving out more goods than he was taking from the areas that he came into contact with. Why was he giving out so much wealth? Pretty much to win political alliances from the folks that he encountered. And he got kings of the African city-states as well as Indonesian leadership to submit to Ming Dynasty authority. That's not too hard to imagine when you consider the size of his fleet, the power that that his men must have exuded just by showing up at the places where they did. Again, there's a couple reasons why I show you this image. One is to explain why Zheng He's missions were successful as diplomatic missions, but another is to compare Zheng He with what Europe was doing at the time. Zheng He makes these voyages in 1405. Columbus really doesn't get started exploring for Europe until almost 100 years later, and as you can see, Europe really wasn't able to fund the same kind of exploratory efforts that the Chinese were. So this demonstrates the relative wealth between East and West. Remember, Columbus is trying to get to the goods of the East, and it's pretty easy to see why, right? Because if you're looking at this image, it pretty much tells you that China and the rest of the East is where it's at. So most of you guys said that you think that the Chinese probably could have made it to the Americas if they wanted to, and there are various answers about why maybe they didn't try. If they didn't, there's some dispute on that too, but if they didn't, a common theory is that, well, they had everything that they wanted. Of the areas that they explored, they figured out they were the wealthiest and the most powerful, so why were they going to bother? Why were they going to make that economic investment? And in fact, they decided to make a very different kind of economic investment. That was an economic investment in themselves at home. So instead of sending Zheng He out anymore, they canceled his voyages. They instead focused on building infrastructure like the Great Wall, rebuilding canals like good dynasties tend to do in the dynastic cycle. They also focused on their agriculture, new technological advances, and economic advances as well. And these in the short term were pretty beneficial, we could say, for Chinese development. In the long term, it might seem like it wasn't such a good idea to isolate culturally and economically, but we're going to bring this back up when we get to the long term, when we talk about European imperialism a little bit later on. Quick note while we're on world travelers. 2 other world travelers from this time period you might want to know about, Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta. Are these guys going to be on the exam? Probably not, but you might see some of their documents on the exam, so that's why I bring these guys up. You might especially see some documents from Ibn Battuta. Okay, remember, he was a Muslim scholar who traveled all throughout the Islamic world, and we believe as historians that his documents were a little bit more accurate than Marco Polo's. So if you're ever asked a question about accuracy of documents on the world history exam, and it involves these two folks, you might want to know that Ibn Battuta is probably a more trustworthy source according to most historians. And finally, what's the deal with America? Why haven't we been talking about the Americas other than a few pages in the textbook so far this entire course? Well, I wanted to end on this slide to remind you guys that historians really care about trade because they care about cultural interaction, cultural diffusion. And as it turns out, there's not nearly as much trade going on in the Western Hemisphere than there is in the Eastern Hemisphere. Okay? And so therefore, there's not really as much cultural diffusion. So why isn't there as much trade going on in the West as there is in the East? Historians have a couple different theories about this, but I wanted to show you guys a theory kind of based in human geography for a second. Taking a look at this map, you can probably guess already, but this is a temperature map. The lighter colors, obviously the warmer areas, the darker colors, the cooler areas, right? And if you compare this map to Spodek's map of trade routes, there's going to be a couple things you notice. You know, if you're looking at Indian Ocean trade over here, right? This kind of takes place within the same sort of temperature zone, right? If you look at Silk Road trade, kind of takes place within the same sort of temperature zone as well. If you look at North African trade, Trans-Saharan trade, roughly the same temperature zone going on there. If you compare that to what's going on in the West, it's sort of the same phenomenon. There's some trade routes going on in the Caribbean and Central America. There's one snaking down the Andes Mountains in the Incan Empire in South America, and those are all kind of sticking to the areas of the same color, right? There's also one that's not on Spodek's map that is the Mississippi River, and trade routes that were offshoots of that in North America, North American Native Americans engaged in. But what you'll notice is that these trade routes over here are a lot smaller, and there's a lot more breaks in them than there is with the trade routes over here, right? And one theory for why that is because of the shape of the continents. You'll notice that Afro-Eurasia is more so stretched out along an east to west sort of line, whereas North and South America are just that. They're going from north to south, cold, to warm, and then to cold again. Whereas here, there's not as much climatic variation. Why is that important? Well, some of the goods that were traded along these routes were agricultural luxury goods. Sugar, for instance, found its way from India all the way to Spain eventually, because there's sort of a similar climate here than there is here, right? Another example would be bananas finding their way from Indonesia to Southeast African city-states, or coffee doing the same, finding its way from the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula to Africa. Goods like that can do that because they can grow well in both climates. Camels were able to survive in North Africa as well as the Arabian Peninsula because the climate was the same. You don't really see that over here. You can't get crops that you could grow up in Canada to Central and South America and have them have the same success. It's not really going to work that way. It's also kind of difficult if you're not used to the climate to travel quite a long ways. All right, you can make trips along the Silk routes, 100 miles here, 100 miles back, because the climate's not going to change too much. But there are some climate lines you might not be too inclined to cross if you're over here in the West. Again, this is not everybody's theory or everybody's belief, but it is one theory that helps to explain why there might be more breaks in the Western Hemisphere trade than there are in the East. And that's it, guys. Thanks for watching.